President. It is no secret that I am strongly opposed to this disastrous, unfair, and destructive piece of legislation that we are debating today that will give massive tax breaks to the wealthiest people in our country, to the most profitable corporations, and to billionaire campaign contributors. What really concerns me is that we are debating, as everybody acknowledges, a very complicated and confusing piece of legislation that is over 500 pages long. And here we are a few hours before we're going to be voting on this legislation. Frankly, nobody has seen it. Nobody even knows what is in this legislation. It's probably being written as we speak right now. Not a very effective or intelligent way to deal with legislation that impacts every American and trillions of dollars. One of the concerns that I have as we look at this bill is there are provisions in it that nobody really understands in terms of who it impacts and whom it benefits. Buried in this legislation, just as one example, buried in this legislation on page 503, section 14504, is a paragraph entitled, quote, "Modification to source rules involving possessions," end of quote. That's the title of that section. Now, what does that mean? It means that, as best we can understand, if you are a hedge fund manager who is a resident of the Virgin Islands, you will be able to get a major tax break on capital gains and a 90% reduction in tax liability on your income. Now, Mr. President, it has been estimated that corporations and the wealthy are avoiding over $100 billion each and every year by stashing their cash in the Caribbean and other offshore tax havens. It appears that this provision will make a bad situation even worse. Adding insult to injury, Mr. President, it appears that this provision may only help a handful of wealthy hedge fund managers who have claimed residency in the Virgin Islands. It has been estimated that this provision alone, one provision in a 500-plus page bill, will cost over $600 million in lost revenue in the next decade. $600 million in lost revenue when we have a $20 trillion debt and 40 million people living in poverty. Now, I see no Republican senators on the floor, but I'm sure that staff is watching this discussion. So I have a question that I would like to discuss with Senator Wyden, but more importantly with some of our Republican colleagues. And what I would like to ask my Republican colleagues is whether or not there has been a hearing on the need to provide tax breaks to wealthy hedge fund managers who have established residency in the Caribbean. I would say to my friend from Oregon, there are a lot of problems facing our country: a declining middle class, 40 million people living in poverty, 28 million people having no health insurance. I am not aware that one of the great crises facing this country is the need to provide tax breaks to wealthy hedge fund managers who have established residency in the Caribbean. It may be one of those great national crises that I have missed, but I don't quite perceive it as being an issue that the American people seem to be deeply concerned about. And I would hope Mr. President, that my Republican colleagues, maybe Senator Hatch or others, will come down to the floor and tell us who this provision benefits. Are we talking about one hedge fund manager? Are we talking about two? Are we talking about three hedge fund managers who are going to divvy up some $600 million in tax breaks over the next decade? And I would yield or ask my colleague from Oregon, who is the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee, his thoughts on the issue.
I'm very pleased that my colleague from Vermont is discussing this issue on the floor. The Finance Democratic staff has been looking into this and been working also with your staff. And I think it would be fair to say that every few hours, this bill just seems to get worse. I mean, we don't know whether in the middle of the night somebody added another round of favors for the powerful interests, the politically well-connected. And what I can tell you is what we have been able to put together as of now. In 2004, legislation was written that we were very much involved in that helped eliminate the loophole by requiring U.S. citizens to be bona fide residents of the Virgin Islands and imposing U.S. tax on income effectively connected with the United States. Now, in the dark of night, as I've indicated, it appears we've got a provision that is relaxing this rule. Now, obviously, and I know the senator from our conversations understands we all want to help the people of the Virgin Islands after a devastating, hurricane. Are we helping people by creating a huge new loophole, possibly for a handful of those people who are especially well connected and can get to the Finance Committee? I'm convinced that if you look at the Paradise Papers, the Panama Papers, what they were warning in those papers was about all of these efforts to stash money and create new options for people to wheel and deal in offshore accounts. So my colleague is right. I continue to wonder why, when we want to ask these really important questions about special interest favors, we look to the other side. We have this barrier between both sides of the aisle. We need somebody here to explain to us and explain to the American people how this seemed to just fly out of the sky. So I'm very appreciative of your raising a question about what looks like yet another scam that has come in to a process that has been one big sham from the beginning. And I appreciate my colleague's question.
Thank you very much, Senator Wyden. And I would just say, according to a number of independent studies, despite what President Trump and the Republican leadership are saying, the overwhelming bulk of the tax benefits in this legislation go to the top 1%. I believe the number is 62% go to the top.
If my colleague will yield, there is no question that he is correct that in terms of stacking the deck, this is not just stacked to the top, but the top 1%, or a fraction of the 1%.
62% of the benefits going to the top 1%. And meanwhile, by the end of the decade, Senator, my good friend, Senator Wyden from Oregon, there is no question but tens of millions of middle-class Americans will be paying more in taxes. Is that correct?
There is absolutely no question about that. We are looking at something like half of the middle class paying more in taxes come 2027.
So here we have a nation today which has a grotesque level of income and wealth inequality, worse than at any time since the late 1920s. The top 1/10 of 1% now owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90%. 52% of all new income is going to the top 1%. And the Republican solution is to make this grotesque inequality even worse by giving 62% of the tax benefits to the top 1%. But I want to get back to this one point. I suspect that when you rush a bill of this magnitude through the United States Senate, when there have been virtually no hearings, no experts, no real ability to have significant debate and discussion at the committee level, what you're going to find the day after this bill is passed is absolutely outrageous provisions. And I suspect, I don't know, and I would like my Republican colleagues to help us here. I suspect, can't verify because we don't have the information, but I suspect that on page 503, section 145.04, there is a provision that will provide $600 million in tax breaks over a 10-year period. I suspect that will end up in the pockets of a handful of Wall Street hedge fund managers. That's what I suspect. Maybe I am wrong, and therefore I would hope that some of the Republicans who put this provision in the bill will tell us how this is going to benefit the people of the United States or the Virgin Islands or any place else. But as I understand it, and again, I'm speaking to the ranking member of the Senate Finance Committee who knows something about this, is this an issue, Senator Wyden, that has been discussed for 1 minute? 1 minute?
Not a minute. And the reason my colleagues' questions are so important is this is certainly an example of what seems to turn up every few hours, practically in the middle of the night. And my colleague raised a very good point with respect to the development of this bill. I mean, we're talking about making $10 trillion worth of changes in tax policy on the fly, not a hearing. Your colleagues, Chairman Enzi, the Budget Committee said, and I've heard it several times on the other side, that there were 70 hearings on this bill. There was not one on this piece of legislation. It certainly didn't examine this issue. It didn't examine the question, for example, of what's going to happen to people with this dagger to the Affordable Care Act. And I can tell my colleague, because he is right to talk about how you bring parties together. I know my colleague did that on the Veterans Committee with Senator McCain as part of a major bill. Our former colleague Bill Bradley mentioned that when he wrote a tax bill, he flew all over the country to work with Republicans. In this case, apropos of my colleague's question, not only did nobody did that sort of thing, they wouldn't even walk down the corridor to talk about working with the other side.
Let me make 2 points as I wind down here. Number one, yesterday I challenged my Republican colleagues to tell us that after this bill is passed, tell the American people that when they rack up a deficit of $1.4 trillion, tell the American people that you are not going to come back and cut Social Security, Medicaid, Medicare, education, nutrition. Tell the American people that you are not going to balance the budget and compensate for your huge tax breaks to the rich and large corporations by going after the middle class and working class of this country. I challenged my Republican colleagues yesterday to come to the floor and tell the American people that they would not do that. They have not responded to that challenge. Second challenge today, tell us what is in section 145.04, page 503. This is a provision that would provide $600 million in tax breaks. To my Republican colleagues, who is going to get those tax breaks? We believe, and tell us if we are wrong, maybe we are, that we're talking about a handful of hedge fund managers. Who are they? How many of them are there? So I would ask respectfully that Senator Hatch or any other Republican come down to the floor and tell us who benefits from Section 145.04.
Would my colleague yield for a moment? I wanted to ask him a question because I'm not sure that we really laid out the timetable of what's ahead. My colleague, of course, is our ranking Democrat on the Budget Committee, is very up on this. We have all been concerned because we've seen it before. You pass these big tax cuts, you get a sugar high, relatively short period of time, then the deficits start rolling in, and what we see next are the cuts in the programs that are a lifeline for millions of people, the anti-hunger programs, Medicaid, Medicare, Social Security. I was under the impression, because I saw comments in the paper, that what my colleague is concerned about has already been announced by the Speaker of the House. I understand that what the Speaker of the House has said is that his plan to take up next the issues of what he calls entitlement reform. And they're not talking about the things that the American people care about, that I'm going to hear about at town hall meetings at home this weekend, holding down the cost of prescription drugs. They're talking about rolling back the safety net, Medicaid, and the anti-hunger programs and Social Security. Is that my colleague's understanding that
what they will do? They will talk about saving Social Security. They will talk about entitlement reform. What they mean is cutting Social Security, cutting Medicare, and cutting Medicaid. And as you've indicated, this is not some kind of abstract theoretical idea. That is what Speaker Ryan is already talking about, but more to the point, that is exactly what was in the budget that was passed here several months ago. My friend from...
Consent request?
I would.
I had asked unanimous consent at the conclusions of the remarks by the senator from Vermont that I be recognized for up to 10 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
reserving the right to object if I could. I don't think UC was granted. I see our colleague from Washington. Can we?
I have a point of inquiry. Was that already granted, the unanimous consent request?
The chair said without objection because the chair did not hear objection.
I would like to reserve my right to object at this time.
I will yield. Okay.
It's just,
I believe
Is there objection?
Reserving my right to object, and I will not object. I would just like to make sure that our colleague from Oklahoma and our colleague from Washington are both accommodated in this matter. Senator Sanders and I have finished. I believe Senator Cantwell said that Senator Inhofe will go ahead. We thank Senator Cantwell for her usual collegiality. Senator Inhofe will go first, and then I would ask unanimous consent that Senator Cantwell follow Senator Inhofe, and I will withdraw my reservation. I withdraw my reservation, and I ask unanimous consent that Senator Cantwell follow Senator Inhofe.
Is there objection? Without objection.
All right, let me conclude my remarks. I would urge my Republican colleagues to come down to the floor of the Senate and explain to the American people what Section 145.04 is about, who benefits from some $600 million in tax breaks over a 10-year period. Is it 2 hedge fund managers? Is it 5 hedge fund managers? What is it? That's my request, and I hope we can get a response to that question as quickly as possible. And with that, Mr. President, I would yield the floor.